fantasy short stories. Gone Hunting by C.W. Stevenson. Isa breathed heavy against her freezing hands. Bloody wind! It sharpened the cold, making each step forward as punishing as the next. She looked far ahead north, to the distant mountains that surrounded the land. Ice and snow danced vigorously in the wind beneath their peaks. Isa was grateful her father, Ebon, hadn't decided to seek out mountain goats. She'd complained to her father several times that a fire and some rest could do them all some good. They'd been hunting in the Great Horn Valley for 3 days now, her first, and with little to show for it. A couple of rabbits and a few crows. It was hardly enough to feed a family, let alone a village. But a stag or two might do the trick. Small chance of that, Isa thought. It had been weeks since anyone in the village had eaten a proper meal. Her stomach grumbled as she daydreamed of charred meat roasting over a spit. Not any type in particular, just something other than fucking crow. Closing her eyes for half a second, she imagined the hot grease dripping down into the flames, where it would then sizzle almost seductively so. Isa could almost taste the... Then, as suddenly as she tasted her imaginary feast, her face was planted into the ground full of ice and dirt. "Watch your step, girl," said Ebon, trudging over to help her up. As Ebon brushed off the ice from her tattered cloak, they heard Ram snort. "If I'd known you were hungry enough for dirt, it could have been arranged," Ram exclaimed over the wind. "Leave it alone," Ebon said softly. Isa growled. "Bloody imbecile!" Her father looked to the ground, unable to catch her eye. "He's the imbecile you are to marry. Don't forget that." Isa glared at her father. She was almost 16, and Ram was nearly twice her age. Not by choice. "A little respect or some kind words go a long way, Isa." "A swift boot to his teeth would be more to my liking." "The man has a farm and military. He's a veteran." Ebon added the last bit like it was supposed to impress her. "A failed farm, and his only military service was a year of lazing about, drinking ale and bedding whores during the siege of Horizon, before they sacked the city, that is. At least he came back with all those noblemen's clothes. What good they'll do now." Raids by the Patrean forces and their allies had left their farms, homes, and lands empty of food and anything else of value. But somehow, Ram had managed to hide his silken loot in his home. With game scant near the village, their hunting party had ventured out far into the frozen valley. It was desperate, and it was sad, but if they wanted their little community to survive until spring, then it was what they had to do. "Will both of you quit your rambling back there?" Ram called back to them. "Let's get a move on. The other hunting parties have most likely returned to the village by now, and as we freeze, they and the rest of the village are stuffing their faces." A pathetic excuse for motivation, Isa thought. Most likely, the other hunting parties had returned with little more than frostbite. The soldiers who'd occupied the village had all but hunted out the surrounding land down to the last squirrel. The only contribution from them was left in the bellies of several of the village's maidens. A litter of bastards would be born all around the same time come the spring, if the mothers did not die of starvation first. Isa counted herself lucky she would not be one of them. Nudging his daughter forward, the hunting party continued on their way, trekking lightly so as not to scare the unseeable herd of walking meat. They kept their bows at the ready, an arrow notched at all times. The time it had saved to get off a shot would be the difference of making the kill or not, bringing home the meat or not, starving to death or not. At the foot of a frozen lake, Ram stopped. "Ebon," he said, peering down in front of him. The tone in the man's voice did not sound like the typical snide remark he spoke around each corner. Isa found herself gripping the bow a little tighter. As her father approached where Ram stood, Ram pointed down in front of them. "Look," he said. Ebon jerked his head back to Isa, and then back to the ground, wide-eyed and unblinking. "What is it?" Isa asked as she began to walk forward. As she came closer, Isa made out what the two men were staring at. Tracks. "How fresh?" Ram asked. Ebon scratched at his beard and shook his head. "Hard to say. A day, maybe 2. Ram grunted. Ram was a large man, but Isa knew for all his manly bluntness, there was a fear coursing through his veins, just like the rest of them. She knew what those tracks were, by their shape, by the fear it left in the men of these lands. The tracks belonged to that of the hooved folk. "Come on," Ebon urged them on. "Centaur tracks won't hurt you." "I'm no fool," cried Ram. "I know they're only tracks." Ebon put a finger to his lips, letting the childish outburst go unremarked. "Shh," he whispered quietly. "We must be cautious. Quiet and cautious." Ram remained silent, only allowing his red face to nod forward. Isa placed a hand on Ram's back. Maybe it wasn't respect or kind words, but it was something. Ram turned, and Isa thought he'd flash a soft grin or squeeze her hand, but nothing. He only stared at her, red-faced, clearly abashed in his own fear. Then, in little more than a whisper, he muttered, "Fucking whore." She looked at him, mouth gaped open. She wanted to take the arrow she had pinched between her fingers and drive it through his fat head, and his head would leak into a pool of blood in the snow. She would gaze down on him, grinning wide. She decided she would say, "What was it again? Fucking whore?" Ultimately, she thought better of it. There'd be plenty of time to fantasize about his death once they were married. A lifetime of it. Exhausted, Isa thought she had just imagined a buck snort. Seeing her father and Ram come to a halt, it proved her senses otherwise. Ebon gestured his head to the left, where a thicket blocked their view of any form of life. Isa prayed to the gods for this animal to die, not to any god in particular, just any that might be listening. They moved softly, but it didn't keep Isa from cursing the snow crunching beneath her boots. Eyeing her father ahead, she mirrored his stance and brought her bow in front of her chest as Ram did the same. She breathed slow and steady, waiting for the creature to pop out at any second. Enough time to release one arrow each. Doubt clouded her mind as her hands began to shake. She wanted to scream at her hands to be still, but as her hands trembled with the cold and excitement, she thought she might as well scream at winter to turn to spring. Waiting for several minutes, in eternity with so much on the line, Ebon made the first movement forward and held a hand up for Isa and Ram to stay put. As soon as he disappeared into the thicket, she felt a moment of panic. It was bad enough being out in the wilderness in the cold, and even less so with Ram, though it was not the cold, the poor company, nor the environment that irked her so, but that of the centaur. Something boiled inside her guts, willing her to turn and face starvation rather than be at the mercy of a centaur and its tribe. The hooved folk were not one to trifle with. Their ancient tribes praised gods much more bloodthirsty than those of the people belonging to the kingdom of Petrea or Germana. Isa had heard all the tales. Every so often, they'd hear news of some poor soul wandering into those terrible creatures' woods, only never to be heard of again. Those who went in and did come back out alive only did so because they were quick to turn around. Isa began to breathe heavily. Her father had been too long. Something was horribly wrong. Finally, Isa broke the silence. "Father!" she cried out in a soft tone, yet sharp and full of desperation. Turning towards her, Ram scrunched his face at her sudden outburst. But then, out of the thicket, Ebon reappeared. Her father smiled wide. "I saw him. A big lad." He made his hands into horns above his head. "Must have heard us coming." "Did you see which way he ran?" Ram asked. "Yes," Ebon replied, but he sounded somewhat unsure. "Which way?" "Into their woods. The horn forest lies a little ways beyond this thicket. We can see it from a hill, this way." The trees at the foot of the horn forest appeared to Isa like a wall, which was only fitting for the type of beast Isa knew dwelt within. It wasn't a wonder why the war hadn't reached so far inland. This land was dark, desolate, and void of any human life, save for the occasional hermit or trapper passing through. If it had been spring, Isa knew her skin would have shivered still. "We go in," Ebon said, "or we risk our people, our kin, starving to death." It was a little overdramatic, Isa thought, but there was some truth to what her father said. Kill or be killed, and in this case, she wasn't sure to feel sorrier for the deer or for themselves. It was already getting dark by the time Ebon witnessed the stag dash into the forest, but now it was as if night was riding on their heels. They would not have long to seek their prey, and lighting a torch for the hunt was out of the question. Not in this forest. Not ever. Moving fast, Ebon kept his eyes glued to the ground. A track here, fresh droppings there. They were getting close, yet they had come too far into these woods for comfort. Every shadow was a potential threat, and with night falling soon, Isa didn't know if she had it in her to keep moving forward. Searching the behemoth trees and their surroundings for every monster her mind could conjure, Isa was the first to spot it. Its horns poked around the trunk of a great oak tree, like dead branches. She didn't bother to stop the others, in fear of making too much racket and getting their attention. She raised her bow, this time without shaking. This was no monster she took aim at, but instead, roasted meat on a spit. Isa took aim, focusing on its shoulder. Through the heart, she thought. Through the heart. She let loose the bowstring, and it twanged loud enough for Ebon and Ram to look back at her. As soon as the stag hit the ground, she looked at the surprised faces upon the two men. There were no whoots of congratulations, but Ram couldn't stop from grinning, and Ebon ran over to finish the job. Sliding out his knife, Ebon knelt down by the stag, prepared to plunge the blade through its heart. But as the legs stopped their quivering, he knew it was done. By no means was the animal large, but it was something that provided them with the means to return to the village not covered in shame. Ebon set to gutting the animal swiftly, wasting no time in doing so. The only time he spared was to cut the liver into thirds, which he offered a piece each to Isa and Ram, who greedily snatched their portions from his hands like dogs under the table. Stuffing their faces quickly, Ebon and Ram then hoisted the stag upward until it rested on a shoulder each and began to march back the way they came. They followed the signs the deer had left on its way in, but found themselves in thicker woods yet. Had they caught the tracks of another deer? With daylight fading through the cracks of the woodland's canopy, Isa felt the urge to panic once again. Spending the night in the woods without the warmth of a fire would surely kill them, and to make a fire would bring... She didn't want to think about it. The track she'd seen earlier still haunted her every step. Ebon soon led them to the foot of a small clearing. Upon seeing the wood columns, Isa wanted to scream, fearing they'd stumbled upon the tribe of centaurs that dwelt nearby. But upon further examination, she saw the clearing for what it was, a burial ground. Perhaps 36 in all, the columns each held up a scaffold, or what Isa saw as an open tomb. Inching forward, she ran her hand up the pine wood of the nearest column, stopping until she grabbed a handful of some furry hide that draped itself over the side. Looking around, Isa had lost sight of her father, but Ram too was at a scaffold, and with one hand close to his face, she could tell he was staring intently at something small and red, so close it was almost touching his eye. Peeking her head above the scaffold, she saw the thick bones of the centaur. Its skull must have been twice the size of Ram's. Gods, the thing was enormous. All around the remains, a plethora of goods and weapons lay about. A bow as tall as she lay parallel to the old bones. She was amazed that anything in this world could be powerful enough to wield such a weapon. Clay pots lay about, some cracked, spilling out grain, or empty where some liquid had once been inside. Then she found a large pouch of deer hide. It had been sewn shut. Reaching the knife under her belt, she grabbed the pouch from the top and was surprised at its weight. Slicing the top open, she spilled out its contents. Gold. 100 gold coins from several kingdoms sat in a little pile. The yellow gleamed in the dying light, and she grabbed a handful, allowing the coins to clink together in a fist before falling back down with the rest. The arms that pulled her back startled her, and she cried out. Seeing the hands that shook loose the knife she'd held belonged to Ebon, she sobbed into his arms. "I'm sorry," he began. "We take nothing. If they've seen where they keep their dead, we could be putting the whole village in jeopardy, as well as our own lives." He brushed the tears from her frightened face, and she nodded in understanding. Ebon continued. "They believe this place to be guarded by the spirits of their dead and by their gods. To come so close to the other side means death in their eyes." "How do you know this?" Isa asked. She'd no clue her father could have known such things. Rarely had he spoken of his own time spent with the Betrayan royal army, or on raids, or defending the village as a young man. But she had known he'd seen things, and so he must know things. Ram took the liberty of replying for Ebon. "He fought them before, young one. When I was a boy, your father entered these woods in a time of great famine to bring back a young woman and her children." Ebon glared daggers at Ram. "Enough!" But Ram dared continue. "When the centaurs had taken them, only your father and a few brave others, my own father being one, set out into these woods to bring the captured back alive. All they found along the way were campfires and small human bones beneath the ash. When they came across the last campfire, the beast had left the woman's head atop the still burning coals. I'd never heard my father speak of—" Then Ebon's fist came punching into Ram's. Falling backwards, the big man crashed into the wood columns, causing the whole scaffold to come down on top of him. Large bones, furs, wood, and debris covered Ram. Frantically, he flailed his arms about until the pieces of the dead creature littered the ground around them. bastard!" Ram shrieked. In a fighting stance, Ebon tossed his bow down beside the dead stag and gripped his knife tight. Isa couldn't believe this was happening, of all places, but a part of her was anxious to see her father teach Ram a lesson. Standing over him, his fists clenched tight, Ebon saw something red poke out from the hand in which Ram now rubbed his jaw with. Ram quickly pocketed the ruby as Ebon's face contorted to a fury Isa had never seen before. "Fool!" Ebon screeched. "Put the stone back! They'll kill all of us! Now help me put this back up!" Ram gasped then, putting his hand to his mouth like a frightened maiden to keep himself from screaming. It was then Isa could see Ram studying the woods behind them. As she watched Ram's face lose a little color, Isa found herself unable to turn around. "Walk towards Ram," Ebon told her, his voice calm, as if the wrong tone could be the death of them. "Ram, grab the stag and take my daughter away from this place." Something breathed heavy, and it grunted something from within the darkness of the Horn Forest. As Isa willed herself to turn, she did so and began backing up to Ram. She moved slowly as the thing's breath matched each step she took, her eyes still avoiding the creature's unnatural form. Forcing her head up, she saw her father, his bow back in hand, pointing it at the long torso of the centaur. Horrified, she took in the monstrosity. Hair covered its body in its entirety. A mane of thick braids hung from its head, only covering one ear, as the other ear seemed to be missing. Tattoos in the shape of swirling vines and some primeval language decorated the centaur's body and limbs, while some shapes were not tattoos at all, but scars carved jagged into its flesh. A girdle around its waist bore a whip, and in its hand, a bow somehow larger than the one she'd just seen next to the dead one pointed back at her father, its arrow more in form of a spear. The flat nose sniffed the air around itself, and it flicked its tongue as if it could taste them already. "Taking in our scent," Isa realized. "Go," Ebon said softly. "Father, no, please, back away with us." Ram had already picked himself up from the ground and the deer over his shoulder. He struggled to pull Isa away from the scene. "Go," he repeated, his eyes trained on the centaur who growled something under its breath. "We should give them the stag," said Isa. "Can't do that, girl," Ram said as he yanked her back harder. "It'll kill him," she sobbed. As Ram pulled her away from the clearing, Isa saw the exchange of bowfire take place. Missing his mark, Ebon lay on the ground, clutching the centaur's arrow that now protruded through splintered bone. Grabbing hold of his knife, Ebon growled his defiance as the centaur galloped forward. Her father's screams stung her ears as Isa ran alongside Ram deeper into the brush. She hoped they were going the right way. She hoped her father would die a quick death. She hoped. Moving quickly, branches smacking their faces as they made their way through the darkened forest, only a sliver of light remained, still enough to brighten their path. Her father's noble sacrifice had given them a head start, at least. As heavy a heart as she carried for Ebon, Isa was determined to see her father's death not be in vain. She wiped sweat from her face and a trickle of blood running down her cheek from a tree branch as she heard Ram scream. "Move! Faster, girl!" said Ram, dropping the stag from his shoulders. Isa stopped a moment, peering down at her kill, horrified at what the bastard had done. She soon realized his urgency as the thunder of hooves pounded the earth somewhere in the distance. She ran, harder this time. Out of breath, Isa wheezed as she began losing sight of Ram. "Wait," she said weakly. "Wait!" Still too silent. Her mind demanded her legs move despite their protest. The hooves grew closer, accompanied by the heavy grunting of their pursuers. God, she hoped she was going the right way. She couldn't feel her legs any longer. Not the burn or the hurt. It was a miracle she remained upright, still moving, still alive. She went sprawling as soon as the whip wrapped around her thighs. Violently, she fought the restraints, but it was to no avail. The centaur came crashing through a brush where he looked down on her with the same pity she might have had on the stag she'd killed, had there been time. In its own tongue, the creature voiced a flurry of accented grunts, praying to its own gods, Isa surmised. Judging from its tattoos, this creature was different from the one who'd slain her father. This one had a lighter shade of hair, and its mane was unbraided and unkempt. Through its flat nose, a bone stuck through each nostril. As it sauntered its four legs to where she lay, Isa's hands inched closer to the little knife under her cloak. Sliding the blade free, she held it out so the point was aiming directly at the centaur's face. It snarled at her, flashing its tongue before it jerked the whip in its hand. Her body crunched against a tree, hard enough for her to drop the knife as she shielded her face from the impact. The centaur began to speak something once again as it came closer, but it never got the chance to finish as Ram's huge form came hurling from the depths of the forest and into the side of its body. As Isa loosened herself from the whip, she found her knife beside her and picked it up. Limping miserably over to the wreckage, she found the centaur groaning with two cracked legs. Ram was picking himself dizzily from the ground, and before he knew it, Isa was atop the centaur's torso, jamming the blade into its face, eyes, cheek, and neck. Blood and flesh flew about as she screamed. She kept stabbing, not hearing Ram until he had physically lifted her. "Enough, girl! Fucker!" It was all she could manage, and she wiped the blade clean on the centaur's corpse. Ram nudged her along. "The forest ends up ahead." With the horn forest a few 100 yards from their backs, without Ebon, without the stag, Isa burst into tears. "Enough of that, girl. There'll be time for that at home." Home. She thought it a bitter word. Her father would never come home again. "At least it wasn't all for naught." Ram said it almost to himself. "Why is that?" Isa asked as she wiped the wet away from her weary eyes. "This," he said, and he pulled out the ruby he'd found at the burial ground, the very rock her father had demanded Ram return. "My father is dead because of that rock." Ram's face contorted from distant to annoyed in a heartbeat. "This rock is our future, girl. That'll be enough out of you. Your father isn't here now to whip the insolence out of you, but I am." Isa ignored his words, only stepped closer to Ram so that she stood no more than a foot away. "Dead!" Her voice shook with fury. Her whole face shook. "Dead because of you!" Then, for the second time that day, her blade entered flesh. The knife stuck into Ram's neck up to the hilt. Isa twisted the hilt in her grip as Ram's terrified eyes filled with tears of his own. He said something. Please, probably. But all that came out was a glob of blood before he collapsed. Prying open her fiancé's hand, Isa took the ruby from his dying grasp and held it up to the light of the moon for a better look. Inside the ruby, crystals gleamed back at her, and Isa thought she might be looking at a new start. A native of San Antonio, Texas, C.W. Clint Stevenson resides there with his wife, son, and their retinue of furry companions. New to the writing scene, he writes primarily science fiction, fantasy, and horror. In 2022, his story, After the Siege, won the prize for second place in the National Fan Federation Short Story Contest. His work can be found in Alien Dimensions, Illustrated Worlds, and the Wicked Shadow Press anthology, Abominable. With several short stories pending release in 2023, Clint is hard at work on a science fiction novella featuring his established intergalactic game warden character, Oden Grey, as well as working on his first novel, a grimdark piece called The Swordsman, set in the same world as Gone Hunting, that will no doubt become an international bestseller. Or at least he hopes so. Hey guys, hope you liked that story. Bit of a grimdark fantasy. Haven't had one of those in a while, I don't think. For somebody that's just starting out on their writing journey, I think C.W. Stevenson might be going places. I really enjoyed this one. If you liked it, be sure to leave a thumbs up and a comment if you're on YouTube. Or if you're listening to the podcast version, just be sure to subscribe for more brand new short stories. I'm Chris Herron, and that's it for today's Tall Tale TV.